Good day everyone and welcome to this new player PvP guide for the Elder Scrolls Online in 2023. This guide is going to deal with two different subjects for new players. The first is talking about what PvP is in Elder Scrolls Online and how it functions, and the second part is how to play PvP, what you need to do to get decent at it, how to improve at it. So to jump straight into it, I will start with what is PvP. Elder Scrolls Online is a game that has a PvE and a PvP section. So one is against NPCs and the other is against players. That's the PvP part. I personally think that it has a lot of depth, this PvP. It has a very good combat system, ESO, and even though there's some complaints every now and then about balance and other things, it's still a really deep mechanic, a lot of things to explore into, a lot of interactions between different parts of your own combat toolkit and that of other people, and generally it's very good for immersion as well, which is of course a hallmark of the Elder Scrolls franchise. PvP has all kinds of fights. It has duels, it has large-scale sieges, it has small-scale guild versus guild fights, and more. And it also has a lot of class identity. ESO has 7 classes right now, and even though there's always some similarities between the classes and how they play, they do feel very unique, each of them. So I definitely consider it worth trying out if you have this game. PvP is divided in 4 different modes. There's Battlegrounds, Cyrodiil, Imperial City, and Duels. Cyrodiil is the first PvP zone that has been released, and it has several campaigns. It has campaigns that are for CP, so champion point level players, for no CP, for below level 50 campaigns, and as for which campaign you choose, I advise you go to the one that matches your level, as that will give you the best time. If you go into CP PvP as a below level 50 player, you are just going to get clapped over and over. Cyrodiil provides continuous PvP. Sometimes there's a lot of action in there when many people are online. Sometimes there's not much actions, for example in the middle of the night. It has 3 factions, Altmerry Dominion, Daggerfall Covenant and Ebonheart Pact, that basically battle each other in Cyrodiil in the large zone for dominance. This dominance is decided by the scoreboards that each campaign has, and you can increase the score on those scoreboards by capturing keeps, outposts, resources that are along the keeps, and scrolls that will count towards the score. Cyrodiil features a lot more than that, of course. It also has some questing towns, it has some bounty boards and capture boards and so forth, but these are the basics of this zone. You play with your allies to capture keeps, and outposts and resources and more, and these objectives are going to increase your score. You also get alliance points for PvPing, and this will also have a separate leaderboard, and you can buy some additional PvP related items with it that you can either sell to make more gold in the game, or you can use it to buy specific bound sets that will help you in PvP. Next up is Imperial City, or abbreviated to IC. This is similar to Cyrodiil, so it's also an open zone with 3 factions, but it doesn't have a scoreboard and it's a mix of both PvE and PvP. Next to the players that roam around there, you also have tough bosses and mobs, and if you kill those you get Telvar. Telvar is another currency in the game, and you can get that next to alliance points in Imperial City. I do recommend roaming around in IC every now and then, because Telvar stones can translate into a lot of gold. Next up is Battlegrounds. Battlegrounds are a smaller instance of PvP, so not necessarily a big zone that is always active. And you are in this instance in a 4v4v4 setup for a quick match of around 15 minutes. Similar to Cyrodiil and IC, Battlegrounds also has 3 teams that fight each other. This is generally the way PvP works in this game. And instead of having these large-scale PvP battles, it is, as I said, 4 players on each team. There are different objectives in the Battleground. Sometimes it's a deathmatch, and then it's just about killing the enemy team. Sometimes there are flag games where you have to either capture flags and bring them to your own base, or you have to capture stationary flags by standing on them for a while. And the way you play can differ a little bit depending on the objective that you get in the Battleground. Battlegrounds also have an MMR system, which means that you will be matched up with beginner players if you are a beginner player, and if you're a more experienced player, you will be matched up with experienced players. Then the last form of PvP I want to talk about is duels. So these are just straight up 1v1s that you can invite any player to. It works in any zone, also in the PvE zones, but there's a prerequisite where you have to be close to each other, so you cannot just invite somebody to duel when you are miles away from them. Now for the second part, which is how to play PvP, there are 2 things that matter in getting better in PvP and into improving yourself. And that is the build you run and the player skill that you have. I'll start off with the build. So it's not the same as for solo questing and PvE. You need a different build for PvP. And unlike PvE, where you mostly focus on damaging if you're a damage dealer, or purely on aggroing mobs if you are a tank, on PvP you mostly want a build that gives a bit of both. You want to have healing skills to keep yourself alive and damage skills to damage the enemy. There are many ways to combine sets and skills in this game for a build, which is definitely one of the attractive parts of PvP for me, and there are also stronger and weaker sets and skills. For gear sets specifically, I already have a video that you could watch to find out what the strong ones are, but as a rule of thumb, you want to slot at least one defensive set in your build. The other set can also be defensive, or it can be offensive, or give you some utility or sustain. For the skill setup, this can also vary widely from build to build, and there's a lot of skills to choose from your own class, from the weapon skill lines, guild skill lines, and much more. But there is a template that I use that works for every class and basically guarantees that you have at least a decent skill setup that will be very good to start out with. And the template is that you want to have a burst heal that you can spam. You want a skill that does a heal over time. Most often this is Resolving Vigor. You want to have a burst damage skill and a spammable damage skill. And you combine those two to damage the enemy. And then you have an armor buff, which is going to give you major resolve and make you tankier, and also some auxiliary stuff depending from class to class. And then there's also a mobility skill that I always have, for example Streak on a Sorcerer or Race Against Time on any other class, which is going to make you move faster in PvP, which means that you can run towards an enemy if you want to chase them, or more importantly, that you can run away in time in case there's a large enemy group showing up, or in case you are in an outnumbered situation that you cannot survive by just healing yourself. All the other skills are utility, buffs, passive skills, and so forth, and this all can greatly depend from build to build and class to class, but generally you will always find these template skills in most of the PvP builds in this game. Next to gear sets and skills, there's also a lot of other things that can play into a build. Gear can have different traits and enchants, and skills can be arranged in different ways, but there's also auxiliary stuff such as the potions, poisons, Munda stones, food, and champion points. A general rule of thumb is that as a potion you want to have tri-stat potions, as the Mundus you want to have either the Agelok or the Serpent to boost your sustain, and for the food most often Jewels of Misrule or the more expensive Orzorga Smoked Bear Horns is used, or alternatively Bewitched Sugar Skulls. All these parts of a build play hand in hand to each other, so this can differ depending on the player and the class and so forth. But if you want to have some inspiration, I highly recommend that you simply watch some YouTube videos of different builds that people run in PvP, such as my own, or you can also visit PvP websites that have builds on them, also such as my own. I have one myself that you can find in the description. And this will give you some inspiration on which sets are good, on which traits are good, and how to combine these different things into making a good PvP build. It's something that you have to learn, and it takes a little time to learn, but generally with these basic rules that I've given you, it will be good to start out with, definitely much better than many other people that I see starting this game. One more note about the builds is that most of them are also not for below 50 players. So as I mentioned before, there are below 50 campaigns in Cyrodiil, there's also below 50 battlegrounds, but not many people focus on builds for that. And the reason for that is that PvP in below level 50 should not be taken too seriously. You're not really competitive yet in anything, you're just learning, you're just having a good time and dipping your toes in PvP and seeing what it's like. But my best advice here is, if you do want to make a build for it, to copy the craftable sets and skill setup as much as you can in a build video that you find, and replace sets that you would otherwise have to grind by more craftable sets. Again, I referenced this tier list video with the best sets that I think are around in the game right now. And if you combine craftable sets from this, you will have at least a decent build, definitely for below level 50. As you then reach level 50 and start grinding champion points and maybe get champion point 160 and above, there's a lot more gear items that come into play, such as monster sets and mythic items. I'm not going to explain all of that here. The important message here is that much of this is also in DLCs or chapters in the game, but you can replace it. I have a website page on this, for example, or you can also go and grind those things, which may take a little time, but eventually will be worth it and can give you an edge in PvP. Either way, whether you have the DLCs or chapters or not, in my opinion, you can make a proper PvP build and it's not required to get ESO Plus or chapters or a new class in order to have a good time in PvP and be competitive. Then the next part in how to play PvP is the player's individual skill. So having equipped a good build is going to help you a long way, but somebody that has a bad build and has a higher amount of skill than you is very likely going to beat you, at least if the skill gap is high enough. Player skill comes down to many different things. There's many tips to give here, and I want to make a separate video about this as well. But for this video, I want to include a few rules that will go a long way for players to get better at PvP. The first tip is to have a good balance between offense and defense. It's important to keep yourself alive, of course. You want to heal yourself if you take damage, and you also want to deal damage to the enemies. If you have enough health, say 30k health or above, you'll have an easier time doing this than if you have 20k health, for example. And you want to make sure to spend enough time in focusing on survivability and keeping that 30k health up. The next tip is to keep your buffs up. So I mentioned before that there is an armor buff that I want to slot in just about every PvP build, and it's important to keep that up. If you have other burst skills in your build as well, for example Leeching Vines on the Warden or Rally, you want to keep that up as well to make sure that you benefit from the burst heal from that and from the Major Brutality and Major Sorcery. On Sorcerer, if you have Critical Surge, you want to keep that up together with Boundless Storm or Hurricane if you have those slotted. So it's important to prioritize that at all times and to have a very good uptime on that. Another thing that I recommend to have active at all times in combat is a heal over time. So most builds are going to have several heals over time, such as Resolving Vigor, the Templar Purge AoE, or the Necromancer Intensive Mender, or Spirit Guardian. And having that active, keeping it active just as if it was a buff, is also going to help you a long way in PvP, because it ensures that as soon as you get damaged, you immediately have something ticking automatically, passively even, that will help you survive. Otherwise, if you get damaged and only then you start casting heals over time, there's a large chance you will take a lot of damage before you get to healing yourself, and that has a way higher chance of you dying. Next tip is to combine skills and an ultimate for burst damage. So builds often have a burst skill and an ultimate. Both these things can be used for a delay in the damage that you deal, and if you combine all that together with a spam build skill, you will have a lot of damage incoming at the same time, leading some players to accuse you of cheating as well. But basically, you want to combine these skills to quickly remove a large portion of health from your enemy, rather than casting everything mismatched or just casting your spam build. The next tip is to use line of sight and your environment to defend yourself. You cannot tank everything in this game. Sometimes you will have to be in an outnumbered situation, or even if you are outnumbering your enemy, that enemy might focus you all of a sudden, and one of the best ways to survive that, next to just having healing up and running, is to use line of sight. If you are behind a tree, people cannot hit you, and that simply equals to a lot of damage reduction, and that is something that you will have to master in PvP as well, just as dealing damage or healing yourself. And then lastly, you have to prioritize defense, in my opinion. So obviously, killing enemies is fun and important, but it is not going to be fun if you continuously die due to not healing yourself or keeping your buffs up. This point really sums up some of the earlier points that I made, but you have to keep your head cool, you have to keep an overview of the fight, of what your buffs are doing, what your healing and your health is doing, and you have to make sure to keep your health up, to heal yourself if you get damaged, and only then think about damaging the enemy afterwards. That's the number one tip I can really give for PvP skill. And those tips are what I recommend to beginner players to learn first as well. As a last part in this video, I want to mention that for the builds and skill, there is also a so-called easy mode in the game, and that is one bar builds. ESO's combat system usually works with 2 bars, but if you have the OakenSoul Mythic, then you can run 1 bar builds as well, which are kind of an easy mode when it comes to combat. I have a video specifically on those builds as well, but keep in mind that for OakenSoul, you do need to have DLC, and you do need to grind a little bit to get that, and only then you can get that and slot that in a build. If you do have that, however, or if you do want to get that, I recommend then watching my 1 bar build video, which has very easily accessible, next to the OakenSoul ring, builds that are also easy to play and yet still effective for low to mid tier PvP. And that's it for this quick overview of PvP, this quick introduction to it. If you just take your time, let it all sink in, maybe return to some points in the video, and learn everything bit by bit in PvP, you should be having a good time. There is obviously a lot more to mention about PvP than what I've done in the past 10 or 15 minutes or so, but if you want to have more information on this, feel free to leave a comment with a question or join my Discord server, where you can also ask any questions and then either me or somebody else will get to you with an answer. Alright, I thank you very much for watching, like the video or subscribe if you like this kind of content, and I will see you next time. Bye!